Okay. Uh, can you guys see my deck?
Mm-hmm.
My spooky shadows photos? All right. Uh, well, as I said, welcome to our webinar. This is our seventh webinar in our series of craft focused talks. They're all recorded and they are all available for free. So you will at some point, either later tonight or just probably tomorrow, get an email with a link to this so you can refer back to it. And please, you can feel free to share it, just don't put it out on the internet. We do keep these slightly restricted. They're widely available for you all, but because we want to encourage people to ask questions and all those kinds of things, we don't generally like share them on YouTube or anything like that to the wider world. So as I mentioned, today's topic is setting in suspense. Our next AMA webinar is going to cover the emotional aha moment, which is always a tricky one. So we're looking forward to diving into that with you. We are a little bit TBD on a date. It will be in January in 2025. And since you all are here, that means you're all on the email list. So you will know the moment that that date is set. So be on the lookout for that. Let's see. There we go. So brief introduction to us, me and Sam, who, for those of you who don't know us, I am Kerry, as I said. That lovely lady to my left in this photo is Samantha Skal. We are both experienced book coaches, certified with Author Accelerator, and we are both obsessed with mystery, thriller, and suspense, with scary fiction, and with twists. We came up with Shadows and Secrets as the writing retreat that we wanted to attend, and it wasn't out there, so we decided to make it happen. And we had our inaugural event just a few weeks ago in Salem, Mass. There's a couple of folks from Shadows on. Hi guys, so good to see you. We had a wonderful time. It was absolutely amazing, and we cannot wait to do it again. Speaking of which, well, I'll announce that in just a second. But who is Sam? Sam is amazing. Hopefully your ears are burning in a good way right now. She focuses strictly on mystery, thriller, and suspense. She works with people from the planning stages all the way through agent pitching. Her superpower is twist brainstorming, and I can attest to this personally. She has definitely helped me brainstorm my way into and out of and through a bunch of twisty things for the little baby novel that I'm working on right now. She is also now not co-executive director, but she is the executive director of Thriller Fest, which is very exciting. She is a Women Fiction Writers Association mentor, and she's the former co-director of Pitch Fest at Thriller Fest. She loves cold water when it's hot. I don't know how she feels now that the weather is turning, probably still loves cold water a little bit, and avoiding bears while hiking, which I strongly encourage her to do because I wouldn't want to do this without her. Who am I? I am Kerry. I focus on helping novelists of many genres, including mystery, thriller, and suspense, plan, draft, and revise with confidence. So I work with writers from the planning stages through revision stage. I will occasionally help with queries and synopses. It's not part of like my official thing that I do because it's not my favorite thing, but if I know your story well, if we've worked together for a while, I definitely help my writers with that kind of thing. So my superpower is synthesizing plot and character and asking a lot of questions. For better or worse. Sometimes I've heard that's for worse. I apologize. My father was a philosopher guy, and so I am very Socratic in my thinking. It's his fault. I blame him. But usually it's a good thing. And they're always just inspired to get people thinking, or intended to inspire you and get you thinking. I am also a WFWA mentor and a Sisters in Crime mentor as well. I love good wine and cheese, and I am having fun drying all the herbs from my garden now that the weather is finally turning here. So if you need some thyme or some basil, I probably have a couple of other things that I have in abundance right now. So if you need anything like that, hit me up. I'm your girl. So what is Shadows? Shadows was a 5-day writing retreat for mystery, thriller, and suspense authors who are looking for a transformation with their work in progress. We limited to 12 writers. We had 8 in our inaugural retreat just a few weeks ago. We have dates now for 2025. So I think you guys are the first to hear this. We're going to be back in Salem on September 17th through the 21st. We're going to be back at the Hawthorne Hotel, our haunted hotel, although I think the attendees can also attest, like, the haunting part was maybe disappointing if you were looking forward to it, and totally fine that we were not haunted if you were not looking forward to it. I did have someone scratch on my door one night. Sam's husband tried to say it was probably a drunk guy from the wedding that was happening downstairs. I said I would rather it be the ghost, so I'm going to go with ghost, but he was probably right. And nevertheless, the Hawthorne was wonderful, and we look forward to being there again next year. So you can keep tabs on all of that at shadowsandsecretsretreats.com. And who are you? Who are we looking for to come and join us for year number 2? So you are a mystery thriller suspense curious or an MTS author. You've written a full-length novel. You do not have to be published. We just want, it's helpful if you have an idea of like all of the work that goes into writing a full-length novel, because it's no joke, as y'all know. So we're looking for serious writers only. You are willing to put in the work. And again, our attendees can attest, like we made them work pretty darn hard. They did such an amazing job. We're so proud of all of them. There is some built-in downtime, but we are going to be very, very busy. It's maybe a haunted hotel. I haven't talked to Sam about whether we want to take that out or not because I'm not sure we're buying it anymore. But theoretically, it's a haunted hotel. So if you're not into that, it might not be the best retreat. No jerks, period, end of story. We want to be wildly inclusive. We worked really hard to create a safe space for people and be really supportive of their stories and help nurture and get people to where they want to be with their best book that they're working on. So wildly inclusive is part of that, and no jerks is definitely part of that as well. We welcome plotters and discovery writers, but just a fair warning that we do a lot of planning. So what is it like? It's a lot of fun, I think. We had a lot of fun. There's definitely cussing. There's optional wine for those of us who want it, and there's no wine for those of us who don't want it. There's definitely new writer friends made for sure. Our focus is on brainstorming solutions versus rewriting. We don't actually do a deep dive into any pages. I think the only time we touched pages in our first retreat was when we did a little bit of reading aloud on the last day, which was really, really great to hear people's stories, but that's not where our focus is for the retreat. It's on character deep dives, it's on twist brainstorming, it's on unblocking you to make sure that you can leave the retreat with a clear path forward and a solid plan for drafting or revision, including very specifically your story question, your protagonist's emotional aha moment, and 3 solid twists, meaning the midpoint, the climax, and the final twist, which are sort of genre expectations for mystery, thriller, and suspense these days. So that's a little bit about shadows. In the next 20 minutes, however, we're going to talk about setting and suspense. That's why we're all here. Specifically, we're going to touch on some elements of setting and then talk about how to craft setting for suspense. And then we should have some time left over at the end for a little AMA Q&A time. That can be about the retreat, that can be about setting and suspense, or really whatever you want. You've got me here, so I'm happy to answer questions about anything you have questions on. So let's get into setting for suspense. I really love this photo that we have there because that sort of sums it up. Probably a little ghosty, a little spooky, a little trashy. Let's start off really, really simply, right? So what is setting? And this is probably like super basic, but good to establish a baseline. And that setting is where and when a story is located, right? So it's the story's time and its place. I'm going to dig into that in more detail very shortly. But just wanted to note here too that setting influences characters and can help define or clarify their worldview. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means and how that works. So setting can take some different forms in a story, right? And I look at it sort of from these 3 different lenses that you can come at it from. It can be talking about the natural world or the environment in which the story takes place. And by that, I mean like literally the big picture, like look around nature. What are the natural features of the world? Are you at the ocean? Are you in the woods? Are there mountains? Are there like lots of people around? Are you in the city? What is the natural environment? What is the flora and fauna that your character is surrounded by? It can also look like the cultural and historical background and context of the place that they're in. And this one can be really important and probably not necessarily one that we super think about. We tend to think more about the natural and then the next one, the physical, but the cultural and historical background of a place can really influence not only the way your character moves through the story, but also the people that they interact with, the attitudes that they come up against, all of those kinds of things. And lastly, the physical locations in which the story takes place, and or takes plate if you have a typo in there that I will fix before I do this again. So what I mean by physical locations is like it's different than the natural world. So the natural world, I mean like the big picture stuff. The physical locations, I mean the very specific places in which your character is moving through. So their home or their apartment, their car, or however they move through the spaces in which they, work in a day-to-day environment, their office space, any kinds of places like that. Those vary. So like if you think of the natural world is, as I said, like the big picture, the big surroundings, that they're moving through. The physical locations are like those interiors or exteriors, but very dialed down. So it's like the focus, the 50,000 foot view, and then the focused view. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about each of these things, right? And how you can use them to build suspense in setting. So the first one is using the natural world. This one can be a lot of fun, right? Because no matter where you are in the world, there are ways to leverage it to up the creep factor. So the few examples that I called out here, like the whistling winds, right? Definitely heard some of that in my hotel room in Salem. And took a minute to say like, no, that's not Bridget Bishop, the ghost. That's just the wind going through the trees in the park next door. But waves crashing if you're at the beach. Animals howling in the woods, right? What natural elements in your setting can add to a sense of tension or dread? Think about what your character is hearing, is seeing, and those things that they can't control because it's part of the natural environment. But that can, automatically sort of put us on edge a little bit, right? Weather is a part of that. And I did want to throw up a flag here that weather is something that we should be using judiciously, I would say. There's a fine line between trope and cliche when it comes to weather, especially in mystery, thriller, and suspense. It's great to use it when it makes sense. And I think like a great example of a place where it walked right up to the line and then kind of, but ended up working out okay was in Riley Sager's The House Across the Lake. Sam and I did a deep dive on that, which is on our YouTube channel if you want to check it out. And I know we talked about the storm and also almost thinking like, oh, he went there. Like, was that a good idea? I was like, it's a storm and there's always a storm, right? But not only did he make it work in the moment when the storm hit and using the tension and all of the things that happened as a result of the storm, things like electricity going out or like something, branches hitting against the building, like that worked, but he also used the impending storm to create a sense of tension in some of the characters' actions and their reactions to knowing that this storm was coming. And I won't say any more than that because I don't want to give anything away. Although if you watch the deep dive, we spoil the heck out of it. So highly recommend that book for a lot of reasons. But that is a great example of using weather, really making it work for you in your story and not just throwing in a storm because you're like, oh, I need something else to do here. So like, let's make the weather terrible. That's where you kind of, you want to make sure that there's an extra purpose to it and that you're really leveraging it to its maximum without going over the line into cliche. This can be a hard thing to suss out, honestly, as a writer, especially this is where critique partners or somebody else who's assessing your work can help you determine like, oh, you might not be using this to its fullest extent, or this might not be, like the best choice for your escalating suspense here. So let's think about some other ways that we could ratchet up that suspense instead. And then a last note on this is just around the seasons. Like, is it swelteringly hot and is everybody getting really angry and frustrated and just, agitated because it's super hot? Or is there a bite to the air? Are people hunkering down because it's 2014 in New England and you've had 120 something inches of snow, so nobody's leaving the house? I mean, mystery, thriller, and suspense tends to work on a very tight timeline, right? Because we're like trying to use that to help escalate tension and stakes. So you don't necessarily have those like big sweeping changes of the seasons, but you can definitely use transitions that way, or you can just, think about what is happening, like what has the climate been like, and how are people reacting to that, and how is it making my character's life more difficult or easier. But we generally don't like to go for easier as writers. We always want to go for the complicating factors for our protagonists, because as much as we love them, we also want them to be miserable so that they can overcome things. So that is sort of the nature, the big picture. The next element that I want to talk about is using cultural and historical elements, right? So thinking about the history of your setting. What spooky, scary, awful things have happened there in the past, whether real or imagined? And you can think of this on, like, again, on the scale of like an entire town or city, some sort of shared cultural history there. You know, this picture, if you don't recognize it, is actually from the Salem Witch Memorial, which was amazing. And I would say that that can play both into the historical and the cultural, because as I know from living here, but also in the tour that we took, you know, the woman who was guiding us around Salem talked about how it's only been really in the past, say, 30 or 40 years that they have really started to reckon with what happened there in 1692. So definitely that the pall of that and the history of that hangs over the city in a really unique way. And that's Salem, that there certainly could, you know, these kinds of things, like there are things like this for just about any setting that you can imagine, right? Especially if you're in cities, I would say, but small towns too. It can be lesser things, or maybe things that aren't as well known in the national consciousness, but might be very, very well known to people who live there. I'm thinking about the town where I grew up, and actually when I was in third grade, I think, a girl in the town next door to us was kidnapped, and she's never been found. And I don't know if anyone outside of, you know, my little area still remembers her, which is awful. But like certainly, like I was never allowed to wait at the bus stop alone after that. And that has really imprinted on me that that happened. And that was like a fear that we all felt for a long, long time afterwards. So something like that, think about how that weighs on the people who are part of your setting.
Remember on from this.
Sorry, Eric, did you have a question or a comment?
Oh, sorry, no.
Oh, no,
I
okay.
didn't know my speaker was on.
Oh, surprise.
Oh,
No worries. Um, so building suspense and setting, talking about physical locations. So think about where your character is spending the bulk of their time. Is it soullessly new, or is it heavily historied? And I admit in these questions, that's probably a little bit of my bias showing, because I live in an old part of the country. We do have some buildings that have been around, you know, for 400 years or more. And I find sometimes that when I go into new buildings, of which we also have plenty because Boston is an ever-evolving city, they always feel like the dentist office to me. And there can be something that's super, super creepy about that too, like just not having any history, just having it being a blank slate. And so you're trying to make meaning and figure out what's has been imprinted or is going to be imprinted on those places. Like something that's completely soulless can definitely be super creepy. How can you make your character uncomfortable in the space that they're in? Whether it feels like it is that history that's weighing on them, or that there is no history there, or there's something in between. What is their personal history with a particular space? They may or may not have one, but if they do, it might be really bad and they might not want to go back to that place. Or it might be that they have a safe space. And I might make the argument that, you know, they should always have some kind of safe space. It's like thinking about it's that same idea wrapped around that you don't want your pacing to be all one note, frantic, frantic, frantic. You need to have some pauses in there where people can kind of take a moment, your reader can take a moment and digest what it is that they're reading, and kind of catch them up. In that same vein, you may want to have your character have a safe place where they can go and retreat to after they've been in a series of like really unfortunate spaces that have just like thrown off their energy completely. And then, of course, the beauty of that is you can turn it on its head and make it not a safe space for them. Gosh, we're really evil. And I hear myself talking about this stuff. I'm like, whew, just not very nice. But that is our jobs. So remember that small spaces tend to make people feel claustrophobic versus large spaces can give a sense of overwhelm. And as with all of these elements, be sure to lean on the sensory details to create a sense of suspense and dis-ease with your characters. Gosh, it's just another typo in there. I'm so sorry. This is terrible. My copy editor, my old copy editor me is just going crazy right now. Um, so with all of these things, like I do, in terms of leaning on the sensory details, don't forget that we do more than see, which sounds really obvious, but I think it's one of those things that seeing, hearing for sure comes up a lot because we're listening to dialogue. Our characters are talking to other people, but don't forget that like they feel things both emotionally and with their hot little hands. That they're smelling things. That can be a really great one in suspense, I think, because there's lots and lots of icky smells. And also taste. I'm thinking of a book that I just finished last night, actually, where they did a great job. She did a great job all the way through with using the setting and creating suspense. Relatively early on in the book, there was a blood plague, and so everything that was touched by water, rivers turned to blood. The wells were just like there was blood in the wells instead of water. The fields were like the blood was coming up out of the fields. Like this is like seriously kind of, I mean, it was a light horror, so it was appropriate for that. But gosh, and it was very suspenseful. You didn't know where it was coming from. You didn't know what had caused it. And so how on earth are they going to be able to fix this? Because not only is everything dying around them in terms of the crops and they're like worried about their survival, but literally there's nothing to drink. So they're running out of water because there is nothing in the wells. So that was a great way that she's using suspense or using setting to create suspense. So a couple of other elements to keep in mind. A fish out of water. If your character is in new or unfamiliar situations or environments, they don't know what to expect. They don't know where to go. Some people may absolutely relish this and feed off of it. I know I am not one of those people. To me, this is my worst nightmare of going into new places and not knowing what's expected of me and just not knowing anything. So that inherently can create a lot of fear in someone. And that can also cause them to do things and say things that then just like create all kinds of like suspense. Maybe they've just put their foot in it, or they're saying something that they should know and they don't know. Just all kinds of potential there for ratcheting up some suspense in them wondering, interiority, like what do these other people know that I should know and don't know, or what are they thinking? Why are they thinking about me? Just creating a sense of paranoia that way. That definitely can build suspense. The other thing, which is probably really obvious, but don't forget about darkness. Darkness is our friend in creating suspense. Also a night owl, so darkness is my friend. But of course, right? Because in darkness we have limited visibility, we can't rely on our vision nearly as much. Our other senses become heightened. And then don't forget that our brains naturally try to make meaning of things and they make sense of things. So when you're hearing something, smelling something, maybe seeing something, but you're not sure what it is because it's really dim and there's shadows or things that are being chased around in the night, we're assigning our brains, our characters will be assigning meaning to those things. That doesn't mean those meanings have to be right. They can very well and very easily be wrong. And so you can definitely leverage that, make them feel really off kilter, make them distrust their sense of reality. Don't forget about that gaslightiness. Like that is a great way, again, like you're creating that sense of dis-ease in your character. Something is not right. And even though I'm trying to assign meaning to this, I also can't trust that meaning because I can't put my finger on it. I can't see it entirely. So, that might be that howl in the woods that I just heard, might be an animal far off that I'll never encounter, or it could be that it's going to be, it's right at the edge of the woods and it's going to come sniffing out my way and come and get me momentarily. So leverage the darkness for sure. All right, so I wanted to go over a few different questions in terms of thinking about how to think about setting, right? So how to get started. I think these are great questions to ask yourself when you're either starting off and you're just planning and trying to figure out what your book is going to be. But another way that you can leverage these is if you already have a draft or you're in the thick of it and you're feeling like, well, the setting, I haven't fully taken advantage of the setting. I haven't used it to its best advantage, or I really want to do more with it, but you don't want to just like go back through your manuscript and be putting in descriptions of like, oh, the walls were beige and there were two windows and a whatever door at the corner of whatever. I don't know. I'm terrible about making that up on the fly. So you can use these questions to think about how you can incorporate setting back into your manuscript and also use it to leverage it to turn up the suspense, right? So start off really, really basic. Just think about like, is your world real or not real? So is it reflective of the world around us, or have you introduced some elements that are not real? And if so, what are those and how can you leverage those in a way? Think about if you need or want the story to take place in a particular place or time. And my guess is that a lot of us assign our settings without thinking too much about them. That may be completely untrue. And so if I'm misdescribing that, I apologize. But I think sometimes we choose either like, well, I know this has to be set because it's relying on a certain event or something, or I'm going to set it in this place because I know this place really well, right? I realized when I was putting this together that I have not set a book in Boston yet, and I don't know what's wrong with me. I really should just take advantage of that. But I would argue that regardless of what your reason was for choosing a setting, think about what can make that particular place and or time necessary for your story. Think about how you can make it so your story could not have taken place in any other place or time, because there are going to be elements of the setting that feed your narrative in the way that another time or place can't. And that is one of the ways that you're going to be able to create a sense of setting as a character, which I'll talk about in a second. Then think about how your setting influences your character's worldview and vice versa. So like if I'm setting a novel in Salem, for example, sorry, I have Salem on the brain, obviously. How do they feel about living in this place that has such a storied history and has both like a really fun and sort of upbeat and entertaining aspect of that history to it, and also a really dark and heavy aspect of that history to it? How do they feel about it? And vice versa, like how does that affect them? How do the people that they meet and interact with, how does it affect those people? Are there people who feel very affected by that, feel very heavy by that? And what does that mean for them? You can also think about if it's important that your character be an anonymous person in a big city, like they're just one of many people working day to day to get by, and they're just like that average person, you're an average police officer, you're just sort of, again, sort of anonymous. Or are they a big fish in a small town pond? When I was thinking about this and thinking about this question in particular, I was thinking about like S.A. Cosby's novels. I think I've read them all now, and I would describe all of his main characters as big fish in their small town ponds. And they're not always necessarily like super small towns. Sometimes they're like more mid-sized, but his characters are always like really integrated into their communities. They're always well known and they're always sort of important. And in that aspect, I think like it would be really hard for them to be in another place. His books have a really wonderful sense of setting, and it feels always really important to it. So that's just an example that I wanted to bring up. Setting out of time, my historical writer's favorite slide, maybe. If your story is not set in contemporary times, i.e. post-2010s, and I say that because of how much technology has changed in the last, 15 to 20 years. And also the 1990s can now be considered historical, which I find incredibly rude as a Gen Xer. But if your story is not set in contemporary times, be sure to think about how life was different in the time period in which you are writing. So speaking of technology, what technology was available? We had a great time in Salem talking about MySpace and remembering MySpace, or not if you didn't use it very much. But like it certainly was of its time in the mid-aughts. So what technology was available? How are people using it? This is a great place to also think about class a little bit, because not all new technologies are adopted at the same time in the same ways by everybody in a culture, right? If you're writing in a certain time period, some people may have had electricity in their houses, other people definitely did not. So that's something that you can compare and contrast and use in certain ways. What societal and cultural expectations were different, and how were they different? How did different people move through the world? We've talked a bit about that, both in contemporary and in historical settings. And then also think about what major world events happened during the course of your novel and how did they affect your character. So this one comes specifically from, I was trying to think of the class that I took where a professor actually called this out, or writing teacher called it out. And it was something like, I want to say it was, the novel was set in the 60s. It must have been 64. If I get this wrong, I apologize. And basically the JFK assassination had happened and the characters did not acknowledge that at all. And it's not that it had to completely, throw off the whole novel and completely change the course of events of the novel, but they just found that, and I can understand this, that like not even acknowledging it just didn't feel realistic, right? And for someone who I was not alive at that time, but my parents certainly were, and they've both told me like, yes, we remember exactly where we were when we heard that news. Like life-altering kinds of things like that, or big events like a world war, even if you're not a soldier in said world war, like it's probably affecting your life in some way. And so to not even acknowledge it just feels a little bit off. Now, like it's not a requirement or a rule that has to be, but it's just something to keep in mind, especially if there's something like really earth-shattering that happened. Like to set a book in 2021 and not acknowledge the fact that like COVID was happening would feel very strange. And you're probably going to get that feedback from an agent or editor who's going to say like, what? No, this is not going to be able to be set. Like we'll need to move this. You can before or after, but not in that time period if you don't want to acknowledge it and if you are writing a book set in contemporary real world. All right, so do your research. Like I said, Kerry research nerd here. Always encouraging people to do your research regardless of when your book is set. Do some research and make some conscious strategic decisions. And the thing that I really want to like throw my hands up and warn you about is that we're writing fiction, so you do not have to faithfully recreate a real place, but also know that if you move things, you will definitely hear about it from someone. I had a friend who was chased through an airport one time by someone who did not like the fact that she moved, like she transposed a few streets, right? Something that should not be a big deal to anybody, but really was important to this one person from San Antonio or wherever they were from. So just beware and acknowledge the pitfalls and the dangers of when you're working in real spaces. Somebody's going to know, and there's people out there who are going to love to tell you when you got it wrong. You can, as I said, since we're writing fiction, I'm a big fan of the beloved author's note. You can definitely use an author's note to say like, hey, I know this is actually here. So like my example here of like, tell those nags and scolds, Fenway Park is in Kenmore Square, but you really needed it to be in Harvard Square on the other side of the river. So there, like, too bad. I know that, and I moved it anyway because it's my book and I can do what I want. But also don't move Fenway Park because you'll hear about it even if you do have an author's note, because Red Sox fans are rabid and we're ridiculous. So I would not personally call someone out for it. I might give a little bit of side eye though. So just do your research, be informed, and then do what you want, but also like I would account for it in that way just so you can like roll your eyes at the nags and the scolds. All right, so as I mentioned, setting as a character. You hear people talk about this a lot, right? What the heck does that mean? The setting was practically a character. So there's a few different lenses through which I view this and think that it makes sense this way. The first one is when it has an outsized influence on the narrative and it affects a character's actions or motivations. Like, in other words, can you imagine The Shining taking place anywhere other than the Overlook Hotel? I mean, maybe another hotel, but it would be all those same things. Like that setting was so important to the book. It basically made the book as creepy as it was. All this stuff keeps happening, right? And the little murder twins and everything. So like In that case, the setting is 100% a character, a very important character. I think it can also mean that, like, we as readers are acknowledging that the story couldn't have happened in any other place and time. For example, if you're familiar at all with Barbara Hambly's Benjamin January series, which I absolutely love, it hits so many sweet spots for me, and it's like historical and mysteries, and it's in New Orleans in the 1830s, and she does such an amazing job of immersing you in that world, not only with all the historical detail of that time period in New Orleans, but also the cultural and social contexts of that time. Her protagonist is a free man of color, and his navigating, he is also the detective, and so his navigating all of those social structures is pretty bananas. And I actually have an example that we'll look at real quickly. Those books couldn't happen in 1990s New Orleans, I would argue. It would be completely different. So I think in that case, the setting absolutely is a character. And last but not least, it's integral to the overall world building. For anyone who's read any Inspector Gamache novels by Louise Penny, I think, no one would argue that the Village of Three Pines is just absolutely critical to those novels, even when even when the crime and the investigation isn't necessarily happening in Three Pines, she always finds ways to bring you back there. And I don't know anyone who loves those novels who doesn't like always just say, oh yeah, Three Pines, like I want to live there. Again, even when it's not necessarily integral to the story. I mean, she always finds ways to make it sort of integral to the story, but it's integral to the whole series. Like that is definitely what the series is known for, I would argue. So so that is another example of setting as character. And we're going to take a look at a couple of examples, and then we'll just wrap up and have time for questions. So this first example is from The Beautiful Mystery by Louise Penny. I should have looked up which one this was in the series. It's not the first one, but I think this is maybe at the beginning. I'm not sure, honestly. But I'll just read it and then talk for a second about why I chose it. So, a curved stone bench sat under the maple in the center of the garden. Most of the tree's autumn leaves had fallen. Most had been raked up, but some were scattered on the grass. And a few, like forlorn hope, clung to the mother tree. In summer, in full leaf, there would be a magnificent canopy throwing dappled light over the garden. Not much of this garden would be in full sun, not much in complete shade. The abbot's garden had achieved a balance between light and dark. But now, in autumn, it seemed to be dying. But that too was the natural cycle. It would be deviant, abnormal, if all was in perpetual flower. The walls were, Gamache guessed, at least 10 feet high. No one climbed out of the garden, and the only way in was through the abbot's bedroom, through the secret door. So I chose this because I think she's doing a lot of like good things very well here in terms of setting. Like I think first of all, she establishes right where we are. We know we're in this garden. I think she does a great job of like the playing on the transition between seasons. The magnificent canopy throwing dappled light over the garden. There is a real sense of peace that she gives you in this, like that sense of balance between light and dark. But then she switches over. It's dying, right? So that kind of brings us down a little bit in a nice way. Then too, that's the natural cycle, and it would be deviant and abnormal if it were in perpetual flower. So she's taking us on a little bit of a roller coaster here in terms of the setting. And then she gets really practical. The walls were 10 feet high. So we pretty much know that there's no way that someone can get in or out of this garden except through this secret door in the abbot's bedroom, which is a great little touch too, right? Because it's the abbot's bedroom. Presumably, he's not letting a lot of people, if anybody, into that bedroom. And there's this secret door to this garden. So who has access to it? Presumably almost no one. So what's happened here? I mean, there's a body here. So that's why she's going into this detail. So how did this body get there, and who had access to actually, was a person killed there? I don't remember that detail now. But she is really leveraging a lot of the detail to both give us a great sense of place in the natural world and also the physical details that are going to be important elements of the mystery here. So one more, which I have from A Free Man of Color by Barbara Hambly. This is from the first book in the series, and I think it might actually be the first page. So Had Cardinal Richelieu not assaulted the Mohican princess, thrusting her up against the brick wall of the carriageway and forcing her mouth with his kisses, Benjamin January probably wouldn't have noticed anything amiss later on. Now there's a story for the papers. January considered the tangle of satin and buckskin, the crimson of the prelate's robes nearly black in the darkness of the passageway, save where the oil lamp that burned above the gate splashed it with gory color, the grip of the man's hands on the woman's buttocks, and the way her dark braids surged over his tight-clenched arm. Certainly the American papers. Cardinal Richelieu surprised with Leatherstocking's sister. It was a common enough sight in the season of Mardi Gras, when the February dark fell early and the muddy streets of the old French town had been rioting since 5 o'clock with revelers. God knew there were women enough yanking men into doorways and carriage gates and public houses on Rue Royale and Rue Bourbon and all over the old quarter tonight. He wondered what Titian or Rembrandt would have made of the composition. So again, I feel like this gives you just a really great sense of place and time. The details that are included, you get right away a sense of the American papers and the old French town. So you're kind of getting a sense of there's this split in this culture here, right? The oil lamps, the muddy carriageway, the gory color, the grip of the man's hands, all of these things that he's seeing and picking up on, I think create a sense of, and the early February dark fell early, so that it's dark, there's this kind of not great vision again. And the things that you are seeing are kind of trying to figure out, kind of putting them in some kind of context. What's happening? Is this happening willingly? Is this woman there willingly, or is she being assaulted? And that there's this big riotous thing. You kind of know, there's nowhere is it mentioned that it's in New Orleans, but if you picked up the book and you didn't know that we were in New Orleans, you could probably guess between the street names and calling attention to Mardi Gras. So those kinds of things, I think all of these elements kind of come together and do a really great job of leveraging different elements of setting in just a few paragraphs again. So that is my spiel. Thank you so much for listening. As a reminder, our next AMA webinar will be the Emotional Ha-Ha Moment, and we will email y'all to let you know what the dates are gonna be for that. If you're on our email list, which you all are because you're here, you'll receive the invitation to join, and you'll also get a link to this presentation. So I think I talked fast enough that we have time for questions, and I will admit I haven't